The night had been unusually cold for late summer, and the wind outside howled like a wounded animal. Inside the private hospital suite, everything was wrapped in sterile silence, the kind of silence that makes the air feel heavier than it should. Alejandro Cortez, one of the richest men in the country, stood motionless beside the hospital bed. His perfectly tailored suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his eyes fixed on the two tiny forms resting inside the clear incubators. His wife, Camila, was pale and exhausted, her trembling fingers clinging to the thin blanket that covered her. The doctor's words echoed in his mind like a broken record. Both babies are alive, but paralyzed. Alejandro had heard people cry before, employees he'd fired, rivals he'd crushed, but never like this. His wife's sobs cut through him, raw and human, something he didn't know how to respond to. He wanted to comfort her, to say something reassuring, but all that came out was a whisper. "We'll fix this." He said it the same way he would talk about a business problem, but there was no confidence behind the words. He made the calls anyway, the best neurosurgeons, pediatric specialists, therapists from New York, London, Tokyo. Every morning, a new team arrived, reviewed the scans, and left with the same expression of helplessness. The twins, Mateo and Marcos, lay side by side, their eyes wide open, following movements in the room, but their small limbs refused to respond. Weeks passed. Camilla began to fade. She rarely spoke, barely ate, and refused to leave the nursery. Alejandro stayed busy, building, calling, paying, as if money itself could lift his children's bodies. He filled the mansion with machines, monitors, and whispering nurses. But each night when the world went quiet, he would stand at the door of the nursery, watching them. Two little angels with eyes that seemed to ask questions he couldn't answer. He remembered the first time he dared to touch them. He pressed his large hand against Mateo's chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat against his palm. "You're strong," he murmured. "You're my son. You'll walk. You'll run. I promise." But even as he said it, he saw the stillness in the child's gaze, calm, knowing, as if Mateo understood something his father didn't. By the end of the second month, despair had settled in like dust. The nurses avoided eye contact. The doctors offered nothing but reports. One afternoon, a specialist from Switzerland told Alejandro quietly, "Sometimes, Mr. Cortez, money isn't enough." That sentence burned in his mind long after the doctor left. Money had always been enough, to fix, to build, to control. But now, in this fragile room filled with silence and small, unmoving bodies, he was just a man. Stripped of power, stripped of pride, and for the first time in years, afraid of tomorrow. It was past midnight when the storm began. The mansion, perched on a hill overlooking the city, seemed to tremble with every rumble of thunder. Most of the staff had gone to their quarters, but one light still burned in the nursery. The twins lay side by side in their cribs, their tiny faces illuminated by the soft blue glow of the monitors. The machines hummed quietly, a lullaby of fragile life. Amara moved carefully through the room, carrying a small bowl of warm water and a towel. She had only been working for the Cortez family for a few weeks, a quiet woman from far away with eyes that seemed older than her years. She had noticed the way the house felt, heavy with sorrow, haunted by the weight of unspoken prayers. The other maids whispered about her, calling her strange, saying she talked to herself at night. But Amara didn't mind. She had seen too much pain in her life to fear gossip. As she cleaned around the twins, she spoke softly under her breath, words from her grandmother's village. Old words, older than she could explain. "You are more than this flesh," she whispered. "You are light. You remember how to move." Her voice trembled slightly as she looked at them. Their eyes followed her every motion, calm but filled with something deep, something ancient. She felt a connection, as if they were listening not just with their ears, but with their souls. She reached out, placing one dark, steady hand over Mateo's chest. The warmth of his small body was faint but real. She closed her eyes. Memories flooded her mind. Her mother's voice, her people's prayers, The nights she'd watched her brother recover from an illness doctors had called hopeless. She remembered the way her mother had said, "Sometimes God hides healing in human hands." So she prayed, not out of duty, but from the deepest part of her being. Outside, the rain hit harder. A flash of lightning lit up the room for a brief second, and in that moment the machines flickered. One of the monitors began to beep irregularly. Amara opened her eyes in alarm, but then she saw it, Mateo's fingers twitching. Just once, barely a movement like a breathtaking form. Her heart leaped, but she said nothing. She moved quickly to Marcos, her voice trembling now, whispering faster as if afraid the moment would vanish. Alejandro had come upstairs after a restless meeting call. He paused at the nursery door, hand still on the knob. Through the half-open doorway, he saw Amara. Her head bowed, her hands glowing faintly in the lamplight, her words rising and falling like music. For a second, he thought he was dreaming. Then he heard it. A weak cough, followed by a faint cry. He froze. His chest tightened. The twins were moving. Mateo's hand lifted slightly, Marcos's head turned toward the sound of Amara's voice. It was small, fragile, but real. Tears filled Alejandro's eyes before he realized it. He stepped closer, disbelief breaking through his usual mask of control. The machines, which had been steady and cold for weeks, now pulsed in rhythm with two tiny, beating hearts. Amara opened her eyes and gasped when she saw him. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of rain and two newborns' faint cries filled the room. Alejandro's voice came out as a whisper, not of anger, but of awe. "What did you do?" Amara looked down at the twins, her eyes glistening. "Nothing you can measure," she said softly. "I just reminded them they were alive." Morning light spilled slowly into the mansion, painting the nursery in soft gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost sacred. The air smelled faintly of rain and disinfectant, yet somehow fresher, lighter than it had in months. Alejandro hadn't slept. He had stayed by the cribs all night, watching his sons breathe, move, and make tiny sounds that once seemed impossible. Every twitch of a finger, every blink, felt like witnessing the beginning of a miracle. By dawn, the doctors had arrived in a flurry of confusion. They ran tests, checked the machines, whispered to each other in disbelief. The neurologist from London kept shaking his head, staring at the readouts. "There's no medical explanation," he muttered. "Their muscle responses are returning. Spontaneously." Camilla, who had barely left her bed in weeks, rushed into the room and collapsed to her knees beside the cribs. Her tears soaked the edge of the blankets as she whispered their names again and again. "Mateo, Marcos." The twins moved their tiny hands toward the sound of her voice, and she let out a sob that echoed down the marble hallway. Alejandro stood back, motionless, his throat tight. He didn't know how to process what he was seeing. He had spent millions trying to fix what everyone said could never be fixed. But this had happened in a single night, with no machines, no specialists, just a woman's hands and faith. When the doctors left to prepare reports, he turned to Amara, who stood quietly by the window, her uniform slightly damp from the night before. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes glowed with quiet strength. "What did you do to them?" he asked finally, his voice trembling more than he wanted it to. "Tell me the truth." Amara didn't turn immediately. She looked outside at the sunlight streaming through the wet glass, then back at him. "I didn't heal them, Mr. Cortez," she said softly. "I only prayed. I spoke to them, to their souls. Sometimes children don't forget the pain of being born. They need to be reminded they are safe." Alejandro stared at her, searching her face for any hint of deception, but there was none. Just honesty, and something far greater than explanation. "You're saying this is faith?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Faith, love, memory, call it what you wish. Some things don't need names to be real." For the first time in months, Alejandro felt something break inside him. Not from pain, but from release. He walked to the cribs, his shadow falling across the two small boys now moving gently beneath the blankets. Mateo's hand opened and closed around his father's finger, and Alejandro dropped to his knees, unable to stop the tears that came. All the wealth, the power, the control, none of it mattered now. What mattered was this moment, this breath of life reborn in his sons. He looked back at Amara, his voice cracking. "You saved them." But she only shook her head. "No," she whispered. "They saved you." And as she turned to leave the room, the light caught her face, serene, almost otherworldly. And for a moment, Alejandro wondered if he would ever see her again. But it didn't matter. Because now, in that quiet room filled with new life, he finally understood that not every miracle can be bought. Some must be believed.